NAMPU 2023 to Nation and Conversation. We're incredibly excited to have you all here to kick off this very exciting series of discussions this week at NAMPU. We've got some very exciting discussions lined up. And one of the theme around this year's conversations is around change and around flexibility. No one can deny the times are changing and we have to change with them to keep up. The old ways will no longer do. We must find new ways to make a better future. Today's first discussion is on succession planning, and that is literally changing the guard. So to our sponsors, to Senves, thank you so much. We really look forward to engaging with you all, to having everyone come and attend the discussions, to watch them live streaming, to follow them afterwards. And we really welcome you to engage with us, if you have any questions, let us know afterwards. So let's kick off with today's first discussion, and we've got a little bit of a video for you to give some context.
Planning for the future directly impacts the sustainability and longevity of an enterprise. And with the majority of South African farming operations being family-owned, succession planning is more than just the handing over of a business. Many farms have grown into substantial corporate entities, and with longevity in mind, those key positions and succession planning become critical.
Die gemiddelde ouderdom van boere in Suid-Afrika is bo 50 jaar. Dit is duidelik dat klem geplaas moet word op vaardigheidsoordrag na minder ervare persone en dat mentorskap in besigheidsbestuursvaardighede en ondernemingsontwikkeling aan opkomende jong boere gebied moet word.
The ideal transition in leadership is one where expertise and knowledge are preserved and existing good relationships are maintained. Effective succession planning minimizes the risk of costly mistakes and creates more opportunities to secure generational wealth. By entrusting our future to the next generation of leaders, we create security for our growing population, not just locally, but globally, while also preserving the cultural heritage of farming communities.
Ek dink deeglike beplanning van erfopvolging in 'n familieboerdery is baie belangrik. Ek dink daar's vir my hoofsaaklik 3 redes wat uitstaan. Eerstens moet die jong boer gemotiveerd word om weer eendag plaas toe te kom. Met ander woorde, as hy klaar gestudeer het of sy klaar gestudeer het, moet hulle graag wil by die boerderybesigheid aansluit en weet daar's 'n loopbaan wat vir hulle wag. Dan moet daar tweedens ook met verloop van tyd baie verantwoordelikheid en veral besluitnemingsbevoegdheid aan hierdie jong mense gegee word en hulle moet natuurlik dan ook die aanspreeklikheid dra vir die besluite wat hulle neem. En dan derdens ook weet ons dat daar's baie probleme met erfopvolging wanneer die ouer mense aftree of te sterwe kom. Met ander woorde, dit moet baie deeglik beplan word sodat die besigheid kan aangaan, dat dit finansiëel volhoubaar kan wees en dat hierdie jong boer ook eendag sy kinders ook eendag weer tot die familieboerdery kan toetree.
Met familieboerdery in Suid-Afrika het ons baie keer al gesien wat produsente gewoond is om te produseer. Hy het 'n liefde vir die plaas, hy's lank op die plaas en hy dink hy het nog baie jare oor wat op die plaas gaan wees. En dan wat ons baie keer beleef is, teen die tyd wanneer dit by aftrede kom, dan kom daai tyd baie vinnig nader. En dan besef baie van die produsente maar hulle het nie die regtig nodige voorsiening en beplanning gedoen om daai vinnige transisie te maak. En dan kom dit baie keer as 'n skok op die boerdery neer. En dis hoekom ons sien die laaste paar jare het daar baie meer inisiatiewe in plek gekom waar boere meer tyd spandeer om seker te maak dat hulle self reg posisioneer, dat hulle strukture in plek het vir die dag wanneer aftrede kom, dat alles reg in plek is en dat daai oorgangsperiode baie makliker is.
However, there are many challenges involved when changing leadership, including legal aspects, tax considerations, restructuring, and family dynamics. That's why a thorough succession plan is a crucial point of discussion in order to ensure a positive outcome.
So that sets the tone for today's discussion, and I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to our panel members. Next to me on my left, I have Gerard Prouvaire. He's a generational farmer from Douglas. Seated to his left is Theo Forster, a well-known face. I'm sure I don't need to introduce him, but he's the CEO of Galileo Capital. You'll also know him from Sakegesprek and numerous other media publications. To his left is Tony Balshaw, international family business specialist and author. He's very kindly brought us a book here, so he knows what he's talking about. He's written on the subject numerous times and helps a lot of family businesses transition. To his left is Dr. Stefan Strydom, Director and Shareholder of SS Wealth Planning and Espro Group. Also very intricately involved with family businesses and those complex transitions that take place. And to his left, we have George Robertson, also from Galileo Capital, but from Galileo Advisory Services. So we've brought, a really specialized group of people together today to share some of their insights on how to manage the changing of the guard. I'd like to start off by giving each of them an opportunity to just give you some context around the work that they do. Ek gaan met jou begin, Gerard. As jy net vir ons bietjie kan vertel oor julle boerdery, die familieopset, hoe lank julle op die plaas is, dat ons 'n bietjie verstaan waarin daai oorgangsproses julle nou is.
Okay. Annelie, ja, baie dankie. Ek wil vir elkeen sê goeiemôre. Ons is besproeiingsboere van Douglas. Ons het my pa, my ma en ons is 3 broers wat saam boer. Ons is redelik gediversifiseerd. Ons plant so 10 verskillende gewasse. Ons is elkeen teer verskillende riviere om die risiko te versprei as kraglyne ineenstort en ook as daar vloede kom. So ons versprei ons risiko. Ons plant en stroop 8 maande van die jaar, so ons versprei ons risiko. Elke broer het 'n sterkpunt en elkeen fokus op 'n sterkpunt en verder boer ons saam. Dit maak dit die ekonomie van skaal is die voordeel van dit en ek dink net as 'n persoon saam boer is daar baie voordele. Jy moet net besluit wil jy saamwerk of nie saamwerk nie. So dis ons boer by Douglas en ja.
Hoeveel generasies is julle nou op die plaas?
Ons is nou eintlik wat ons so as familiebesigheid is die 2de generasie wat is so saamboer.
Uitstekend, dankie. Theo, apart from the public knowledge everyone has of you, give us some insight into your personal passion for succession planning.
Look, thanks, Annelie. I think for me the key is that a family business is a very successful business form. If you look at the international motor corporations, retail corporations, most of the successful businesses are family businesses. But the key is, in terms of the planning, to make it successful transition from one generation to the next generation. And that's where the challenge lies. So although it is a very successful business form, it has challenges. And you need to work on that. And if you get it right, you will create an asset, not only for the family, but for the broader community that you do business in. And why I'm passionate about it is, as agriculture grew in South Africa, in terms of farms getting bigger, more specialized, and in effect ended up as professional businesses, that succession planning becomes more and more important. Otherwise, the family is going to lose the asset. And the key here is planning, and as Gerard stated, the first decision is, do you want to be a family business? And if you want to be a family business, then make sure that you plan accordingly and you put the structures in place so that the wealth that a generation creates can be transferred to the next generation.
And I suppose, few people really sit down and say, well, is there a choice? If you start off as a family business, that's sort of just the assumption that it will always be a family business, but to make a conscious decision to either keep that model and refine it or to change it.
Yeah, the point is, if you don't spend time in refining the model, there's a very good chance that within a generation or two, there will not be an asset left. And that's a risk.
Tony, give us some idea of the daily work that you do in this field.
All right, so I'm a bean counter by profession, but one that believes there's life beyond the balance sheet. Unfortunately, I realized this in my late 20s and got engaged in working with family businesses in South Africa and internationally. So I absolutely immersed myself in the field. And what you've got is an emotion-based family system where there's caring, sharing, nurturing, lifetime membership. to a task-based business system that's got an outward orientation, it embraces change, it operates as a meritocracy. You put the family those two together in a family business, and you've got huge potential for conflict. And so what one's got to look at is what I've called the 3 and now the 4 circle model. By virtue of being family, there's certain dynamics that you're dealing with. By virtue of bringing your career and being involved in running the business, well, that's management. Then you've got another circle called ownership. And ownership is some of the dynamic we've already spoken about. And then the individual. What are the individual's goals, ambitions, life plan? And if you can find an overlap of that shared dream, you've got something to work with. Otherwise, it's problematic. And you have the Malthusian effect, where just the multiplier effect, 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation. So I stayed with a friend last night, and they basically dealing with two transitions. From a senior generation who's in the early 80s, to his generation, and then from his generation into the kids that are now in their 30s, and they're looking, well, they've studied, do they come into the business, do they exit the country? So there's a lot of people and relationship issues that one's got to deal with beyond, and then you get into the important points of the structuring and how you go about structuring.
Yeah. And I mean, relationship management, as you said, that's essential for sustainability of any business.
Sure.
Stefan, give us some insights into what you do, how you're involved specifically in agriculture, and some of the complex considerations that you help families deal with.
Yeah, thank you, Anli. Thank you for the opportunity and the privilege. It's a real privilege to talk to you this morning. I'm part of SS Wealth Planning. It's a subdivision of Senwes. And I'm also an ex-bean counter, auditor by profession. But what I didn't like that much about the profession was the retrospectivity thereof. You look backwards. The planning side of it was very, very interesting to me. So I changed quickly to the tax side of things. And it just so evolved that I was very much involved with planning and tax structuring and families and so forth. And I think the succession side of it for me, it's all about the survival of the business. And in South Africa these days, we need businesses that's tough and that can survive the economic climate. So I'm day-to-day involved with these things. I think our business proposition is probably that we do look at the legal side of businesses, the auditing side of businesses, the accounting side of businesses, and also the investment and the policy side of businesses.
I think you have some in common with that, George, from your experience in helping families really find a strategic structure for the business. Perhaps you can tell us more.
Yes, Anli, good morning. We assist farming family businesses with drafting family constitutions. So, when, as Tony said, when you look at the different relationships between the parties involved with the family business, you need a document to regulate that relationship. And obviously, as part of that document, succession planning is an integral part of that. To look at the different divisions within the family business and to ensure that you write down the rules and regulation in terms of how succession shall take place in the different divisions of the family business.
Okay. Perhaps we should stop for a moment and just look at some of the overwhelming or dominant challenges in succession planning, what people get wrong, where the major hurdles are. And then we can look for solutions from there, because there's no doubt that, succession planning isn't something new. It's something that, transition will always happen. But perhaps, as you said, Stefan, the climate is so much tougher. And that planning really can make or break a business. Ek wil weer by jou begin, Gerard, en dalk kan jy vir ons vertel. Jou pa's nog steeds op die plaas. Julle 3 boeties boer saam. Wat was van die grootste uitdagings in terme van 'n plek kry vir almal se spesialiteite?
Ja, nee, ek dink die belangrikste van alles in familiebesigheid is jou pa met jou geleentheid gee. En ek dink dis wat 'n klomp van ons ouens die bus mis, die oordrag van pa na seuns of skoonseuns ensovoort. En dogters. Ja, en dogters. Ja, nee, so ek dink dis verskriklik belangrik. Ek dink ons moet verder kyk. Jy wil tog jou legacy laat aangaan. 'n Legacy stop in 1 generasie, dan sy vernietig. Ek dink dis belangrik. So wat jy my gevra het, 'n ou moet beplan hoe gaan jou familie saamwerk, en ek dink jy moet groot genoeg wees om te sê ek is nie 'n goeie aankoper nie, maar ek het 'n broer wat baie goed is daarin. So ons gee hom die geleentheid om vir die hele boerdery op die ekonomie van skaal aan te koop. Ek is die bemarker, so ek het al die produkte in my hand om die hele besigheid se produkte te bemark. So ek het weer die ekonomie van skaal. My jongste broer is 'n baie tegniese ou, so enigiets wat ons vir ander pomphuise bou, ek vat net 'n voorbeeld, is hy ongelooflik goed. So ek staan dadelik terug as ons dit doen. Alles is op my gronde. So ek dink 'n ou moet besef, as daar tekortkoming in jou besigheid is, kry kundiges in, laat dit kan voortleef. Ek dink dit is baie belangrik.
I want to come to you, Theo, because we've talked about this before, and I think the one realization is that you pointed out last night. The business is going to grow at a slower pace than the family will grow. So at some point, you're going to sit with more family members than you have space for, and making those emotional decisions of who gets to be a part of it in the daily running, who will be a shareholder, and how does that structure provide, can it provide for all the family members?
Now that is, I think, what we all discuss and what the major challenge is. The family mathematically will always grow faster than a business. There's no way that a business can grow as fast as a family can multiply. I just want to link onto what Gerard was saying is, I've been to their farm and I've observed how they operate together. The key element that makes them successful that you don't always find is the absolute clear communication lines. They will discuss on a very clear, honest basis every single strategic decision, every challenge, every opportunity will be discussed. That includes how things are functioning. So in terms of managing the process of the business versus the family, that's where things like a family constitution plays a role. But even before that, it is the discussion between family members as to how they see this business. You first have to decide this is a family business. And once you've decided it is a family business, you need to decide how we will manage that process. Because remember, and you only decide that when everybody is still talking to one another. You can't decide that when the family is in a feud situation. So while everybody's happy working together, you have to decide, how are we as a family going to handle succession planning? Is there a process of deciding who can be the CEO? How are we going to manage conflict? Because conflict will arise. How are we going to manage that? How are we going to decide who can become part of the business and who cannot become part of the business? And those things need to be set out by let's say, as early as possible in this generational phases. Otherwise, it gets very complicated. You can't leave that to three brothers, each having 3 kids, and now you're at 9, and then 27, then 81, and then it just goes out the window. So you have to decide. And those decisions have to be made while everybody's talking to one another. Unfortunately, there's not a simple cookie-cut solution. Families differ, and every family has to decide how they want to implement that. But that is a core challenge that needs to be discussed, needs to be planned for, and needs to be structured, both from a emotional or a vision point of view, or a dream point of view, as well as from a legal, technical point of view. But remember, the dream or the vision comes first, and then the legal documentation. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
It's something you're quite passionate about, Tony, is this dream and the vision. Families are emotional. People are emotional. And I think often that's where those critical decisions and the strategic planning goes wrong, because nobody wants to admit, oh, hang on, how many years do I have left on the farm? Can the farm support me in my retirement and my children? How do you advise people to make those emotional decisions that lead into critical thinking?
Okay. So the CEO in a family business is called the Chief Emotional Officer. That's what it stands for.
Is it usually the woman?
No. I've met some very good people in the agricultural business where the ladies actually run the business. But you're correct. Communication, as you mentioned, is absolutely critical to that people are able to communicate. You know, I spoke about the end of the John Wayne myth, where all the knowledge, expertise, experience is centralized in one person, to where it gets decentralized. And the roles that you're talking about, different roles they play, really is fantastic. But it doesn't mean every family is going to be able to do that, because trust is fundamental. And trust means I can rely on that person's competence to do what they say they will do, and they've got the family interests at heart. So it's this shared vision that comes into it. So it's very special. It's not, you cannot automatically assume that there's going to be continuity of the family in relation to this business. We spoke about family money is patient money. They continue to reinvest in the business. How do we get money out to facilitate the senior generation exiting? Because if their wealth is tied up in the business, they're not going to exit. They cannot, because they're providing the sureties and everything else. So there's a lot of dynamics, and that's where people have spoken about the family constitutional creed. You start off by talking about what is our vision, what are our values that we've got, and then how are we going to deal with the governance of the family. Because the family businesses that are large, like we saw in the video, they've professionalized the business. They've brought outsiders in, and they play key roles in relation to the business. So the family doesn't have to be on top of each and every aspect. They don't have to be involved in the operations themselves necessarily. But again, it's dependent on size. But I better stop, otherwise I'll talk.
But just don't underestimate what Tony's saying, that it's very difficult for the older generation to exit if there's not capital somewhere.
Call it paper rich, cash poor.
Yeah, that's the problem. So that why would you exit a family business if you all of a sudden is going to sit and ask for fuel for the bucky, or ask for something? You don't want to do that. So the point is, if that planning was not done in terms of who's going to look after the exiting family, that exiting family will not exit. And that's simple human nature. So that, in a lot of farming enterprises, because all the money goes back into the farm, that gets neglected. And then how can you expect of the older generation to exit? Because they're going to lose their status. They're going to lose their cash flow. And I think that is, one shouldn't underestimate that point.
I want to come to you, George, quickly, because scale seems to be very important in the considerations. Is succession planning important for any family farming business, or is it only really important when you surpass a certain scale of operation?
Yeah, and it's critical for all family businesses. Obviously you have different levels, and with large businesses there's a lot more complexities. You've got to look at a lot more companies, a lot more trusts, and a lot more other aspects where you have to look at succession on that level as well. But the principle of succession planning, there's two certainties in life: death and taxes. So the older generation will have to hand over, and you've got to look in each business that what are the different divisions that we need to deal with in that business, in terms of where succession needs to take place. So it's certainly relevant for all businesses. Yeah.
Stefan, give us a sense of the kind of process, because some people may feel naturally inclined to want to protect their family unit. And you do that sometimes unwittingly by withdrawing from outsiders, saying, well, hang on, these are family issues, let's handle them as a family. But at some point you need to recognize you need that outside expertise. You need someone with a fresh eye, of objectivity, to give you guidance and to say, hang on, these are the challenges that you have completely missed. These are the orange flags.
Only true, very true. I think the important thing with regards to family businesses, and it's a positive and a negative. The positive is that you tend to make decisions objectively, but there's a bit of heart in there. There's a bit of emotional subjectivity in the decision making. So that's a positive, but it can be also very negative in terms of you're not sticking to healthy business principles, etc., etc. And I think going forward, I think the key word is to professionalize the family business. You must professionalize the family business. And I mean, in various businesses that I've been partisan in, there's lots of external trustees. Sometimes 50% external trustees as opposed to 50% internal trustees. Just to get that outside feeling, that outside objectivity that's so needed in family businesses. So I think it's a pursuance. It's an internal decision that the family must decide to do. they must pursue external influences there.
Gerard, dalk kan jy vir ons 'n bietjie ekskuus, inligting gee oor hoe julle die besluitneming benader in terme van eienaarskap. Want vir iemand om in 'n besigheid te belê en regtig al sy fokus te gee, moet hy of sy voel ek het 'n belegging wat vir my iets kan uitgee. Ek het veiligheid, daar word na my omgesien. Hoe het julle dit gestruktureer dat almal wat deel is van hierdie familiebesigheid tot 'n mate eienaarskap ook het van die bates?
Ja, André, ek dink wat belangrik is wat ons gedoen het, geen ou is meer belangriker as 'n ander een nie. Jy weet, my ma, my pa en ons is 3 broers, almal is equal. Daar's die oudste broer wat sê ek is 3 jaar langer is, dis die jongste boetie op die plaas ensovoorts. Ons is al 3 boere in murg en been. Ons het om 'n tafel gesit en te sê, praat so plus minus 20 jaar terug. Ons wil iets moois bou. En almal het ingestem die dag om dit te doen. En my pa het ons geleentheid gegee, elke seun, om hom te bewys. Ons kon gemaak het wat ons wil, ons hoef nie te geboer het nie. So elkeen van ons het na universiteit eers oorsee gewerk of iewers in die land, net om bietjie nie onder jou pa te werk nie, onder 'n werkgewer te werk. Dit was verskriklik belangrik. Jy weet, daar leer 'n ou reëls, jy moet binne reëls bly, want nou gaan jy dadelik plaas toe en dink jy kan maar laat inval môre, ek wil net 'n voorbeeld gebruik, want jou pa is tog die baas. Ek dink as 'n ou net daai beginsels, jy moet binne reëls bly op jou plaas, net as dit die begin is jy 100%. Ons het toe almal ingekoop in die besigheid. Ek bedoel, jy droom ons om suksesvol te wees, ons het almal gedroom. En op die einde van die dag val als eintlik baie mooi in plek. Laat daar konflik is soms, gesprekke is, ons het baie goeie kommunikasie, maar laat ons redenasies het, is verskriklik belangrik, want ek dink dit laat 'n ou se oë soms oopgaan, want jy raak so 'n bietjie vasgevang in jou eie rigting. So ek dink is belangrik, ons het gesê, as wil die ding suksesvol maak, dis hoekom ons het 'n ou soos Theo ingetrek, wat ons raadgewer is, ons het bietjie tekort geskiet in sekere elemente, en ons kry ouens in, om Kali Skuman help ons soms bietjie, ons het gesprekke met hom, hoe moet 'n ou die ding vorentoe vat? En ek dink ons almal sien vir ons 'n toekoms in die boerdery, en ons staan saam op en dit is eintlik ongelooflik as 'n ou kan saamwerk.
Theo, we've also talked about entitlement in a family, because there can, in the next generation and the generation after that, be this expectation that, hang on, I've got a career. I can just be on the farm. But that realization that not everyone can have a sustainable piece of the pie, that realization needs to come soon enough. But how does one address that?
First, as a point of departure, entitlement is a red light. You are not entitled. You are privileged and honored to happen to be in a family business, but you are not entitled. You're not entitled to a role. You're not entitled to a dividend. You're not entitled to any job. You are not entitled. So once you get to the entitlement area, it becomes a very difficult area. Simply because if you take one step back, a family needs to have a vision that they want to be a successful family business. But that means that as much as they want to be a family business, they need to be a business. And in a business, decisions need to be made on merit and on, is there an opportunity in the business? Is there a role in the business? But you're not entitled to that. And I've just seen with families, not only in agriculture, but in other family businesses, once an element of entitlement creeps in, it is a very early warning sign, because nobody should be entitled. You should work together for the best interest of the business. And where that dichotomy comes in, entitlement means what's in it for me. The process should be, what is in it for the family business, not for me. And you have to make peace with the principle that the aim is to grow an asset to benefit generations to come. Nobody's entitled to anything. And that's why even you find with older family farming generations, all the capital is invested back into the business. You're not in there for the dividend. The dividends is infrequent, but you're not entitled to it. So entitlement is actually a red light, and that should be sorted out in terms of the family constitution, how's conflict resolved, How is succession planning managed? And what do we do with family members that are not part of the business because they're not entitled to anything? And it's a careful, it's a area that needs to be very carefully managed.
There's also the struggle between keeping people on the farm, but not everybody. Some people will naturally have an affinity for something, study in a direction that does not bring them back to the farm. That's inevitable. It's not, it's not a bad thing. But to make sure that there is sustainability and longevity to draw the people with the necessary skills back to the farm. Once they've gone out and gotten experience, worked for someone else, honed their skills. What are your thoughts, Tony, on having those discussions early enough? Because you don't necessarily know when you've got 3 sets of children or grandchildren what they want to do, but you've got to secure the future of the farm for the next 10, 15 years before they've made those choices.
Yeah, it's complicated because you've got the family planning as a business planning. I once got introduced in a massive conference, and this is Tony Belcher, head of our firm's family planning division. But what one's got to do is you've got to get back to roles and the role confusion that can happen. So by virtue of being an employee in the business, you get a market-related remuneration. By virtue of being the owner, you get dividends and share price appreciation. And so that's why even with the dividends and taking money out of the profits of the business, you either take it out in a salary, but that's by virtue of that wearing that hat of being an employee, or by virtue of being an owner. The gifts and bequests are by virtue of being a family. So there's often a role confusion that occurs. So getting back to what are the goals, ambitions, life plan that the individual has, tying that into the family, and then you've got something to work with in terms of going forward. But to say, in order to be a legitimate member of the family, you've got to come to the business is wrong, because that creates the problems. So people must have the freedom to be able to still be involved in maybe a role in governance, maybe in terms of beneficial owners of it, and that's where these independent trustees come into play. They're so critical to actually achieve that. So the issues family businesses face are similar, but they've got to find their own unique solution. So if you look at conflict's normal. How do you handle that? Because you're going to have different views on it. You were talking about how important it is to redeneer, to reason, to talk about it, to put it there, because you're not always going to get your own way. So I find that often when I get called in, the lawyers haven't worked because a lawyer says, you're my client, I'm going to represent you, you're going to win, the other person's going to lose. So you'd rather go for a mediation type process. And sometimes you bring outsiders in to work on your values, to work on triangulating, because you and I might have an argument about something. Bring them, they help to triangulate the conversations. So there's no one cookie-cutter recipe for any of these issues. And I've dealt with a whole spectrum of issues just in my answer.
In terms of ownership, putting trusts in place, how do you advise people, George? And I know it's a broad question. You can't give one solution for everybody. But in terms of making those difficult decisions, do you hold on to land? Do you sell it, put it back in the business? Those are big questions that families need to ask themselves, and they often have a very big emotional, sentimental component to them. Talk to us a little bit about that strategic setup of a family business.
Yeah, only most, most farming businesses, family businesses, the underlying owner is a trust, and there's reasons for that, because there's not a deemed disposal on death or succession, from a capital gains tax perspective and from an estate duty perspective. So it is critical for trusts to be involved. But, every business is unique, and on ownership level, we often find different models. We have some families say, and we call it like the equal distribution model. They've got 3 children, and each child would have a trust, and then you often have the challenges of having active and inactive members. One is a farmer, the other one is a psychologist. So the interests are often not aligned. But then the ownership relationship is dealt with contractually. So you have that sort of a model that you can in some way protect, but you often have challenges. Then you have an ownership model where it's an unequal distribution. We all know, the typical one, the oldest son or the oldest daughter, takes over the farming enterprise, and the inactive members take the beach house and the cash. And then also a no-right model, which is a model where, there's no expectation and there's no distribution of assets. And, you add a contribution towards the farming business. And, when you go, hopefully you were remunerated properly and you could save outside of the family business, but then you can hand over the business to the next generation. So there's a couple of models, and, each one is unique, and each family business have components of each model in them. But it's important for you to deal with the ownership because, as we know, that the assets has to be transferred through generations, and the family grows faster than the business. So if you're going to slice and dice it, you're not going to have a family business anymore after a few generations.
And you can't assume that that transition is only going to happen in 10 or 20 years. Put off that planning because things happen very unexpectedly, and without a plan in place, that transition creates this kind of downward curve in a business. Stefan, talk to us about longevity and sustainability, because you want to try and avoid that transition period being so disruptive that the failure to plan is what causes the business to tank. What kind of principles can a family put in place to ensure that there is a smooth transition? And that's not just about planning far in advance. There's some, business principles that you can apply.
Yeah, also very true, Anli. I think it all boils down to openness, communication between the family members, and to start early. I cannot overemphasize that you must start early. You can just imagine if a business, I always talk about the catalysator. Whilst the catalysator is still in life, one must conduct these kind of discussions. Whilst father is still in life, have the discussions with the sons and the daughters. And with any fledgling person that comes into a business, to have set parameters, that a person flourishes with set parameters. So the earlier these kind of things are spoken about, what's going to happen in future. Maybe it's not the oldest person that's going to be the CEO. It might be the more dynamic middle person. The earlier these things are spoken, and I like to say reduced to writing as well. The vision must be reduced to writing because then there's commitments. So I like those notions. The most failures I've seen is because the lack of openness, the lack of communication, and it's really entrenched because there's emotions involved. Sometimes the catalysator doesn't want to touch on these things because there's emotions. But we all must realize a family business is a business. First and foremost, the business must survive. The business must make profit sense. And then all the other things must fall in place. So firstly, it's the business principles that needs to be discussed.
Theo, so one of those elements that helps to ensure a smooth transition is skills and relationships. In terms of managing the skills, the critical skills, the people that you have, the knowledge that they have, the relationships that they have, making sure that the next generation meets those criteria. Training and mentorship, oordrag van vaardighede oor 'n tyd word absoluut belangrik.
If you remember, the key of a family business is the fact that the business needs to be run as a proper business. It needs to be a successful business. If it's not a successful business, there's not going to be an asset for the family. So from a point of departure, the business should be run along proper business sense, business rules and principles. That means the different people in the different roles should be professional people acting in the best interest of the business and making sure the business survives. So therefore, the skills that's required, if it's not in the family, it should be sourced outside of the family. You should never appoint a family member because they are a family member. You should appoint them because they have a skill set that will contribute to the long-term sustainability of the family business. Otherwise, you're going to make mistakes going forward. Now, it's easy to say, but we've got 3 sons, one of them needs to come into the business, or the oldest son needs to come into the business. The point is, if that person is not going to make the business successful, that person should not be in the business. Otherwise, the whole family is going to lose. Now, if you look at various family businesses, and I'm going to take one step back, a lot of family businesses has a set criteria of expectations, and Gerard pointed on that. You need to have spent time, in their case, outside the family business. You need to work for a boss to learn certain skills. And you find a lot of family businesses have got certain almost rules or certain customs. There's a very well-known family business in South Africa in the agriculture sector that if you go back 3 generations and you look at where the CEO studied, where his son studied, where his grandson studied, where is actually the CEO's father studied, where they did their master's degree, what their role was in terms of entering the family business. There's a set pattern. And that pattern is almost a criteria to make sure that whoever becomes the next generation actually has the skill set and the experience to take the business further. And if you don't tick all those boxes, well, you're not going to be the CEO of the family business. But it comes back to what is best for the business. And that needs to be the point of departure. Otherwise, in any other business, being at a family business or a non-family business, if you appoint somebody that's not competent, the business will not survive. If a family business employs somebody that's not competent, the family's asset will not survive.
Gerard, hoe het julle dit benader? Jy het gesê elke van die broers het 'n spesifieke fokusarea waarin hulle natuurlik goed is. Was daar posisies in die besigheid wat julle gevoel het hier's 'n leemte wat nie een van julle lekker aanspreek nie, kom ons bring iemand anders in? En by dit ook, is daar een van julle wat 'n natuurlike 'n leierrol het? Is daar een van julle wat, dis nou dalk 'n moeilike vraag, ek wil jou nie op die spot sit nie, maar elke besigheid moet tog iemand aan die bopunt hê wat that takes accountability. The buck stops there.
Ja, en jy is seker maar een wat die finansies hanteer, nee.
Dis eintlik waarby ek wil uitkom. Wie skryf die checks?
Ek is maar die een wat so af en toe vir broers sê, ons kan nie nou die bytyd 'n jaar vas en so voort. Maar opgrapper gewys. Nee, Annelie, wat ons gedoen het, ons het om 'n tafel gaan sit. Ek dink in die opsig moet jy moenie, jy weet, die game is groot. So jy moet, ons het elkeen 'n geleentheid gegee. Ons het met tyd, ek bedoel ons het op plase groot geword. Ons het gesien wat is elke ou se sterkpunt. Jy weet, 'n tegniese ou straal dadelik uit en wat ons toe gaan kyk het, ons kan gaan swat het skool gaan waar ons wil. So ons het dadelik, as jy gaan kyk waar jy gaan skool gaan, waar jy gaan swat. Ek bedoel as jy kan swat waar jy wil, gaan jy tog swat wat jou passie is. So ons het, ek dink dit was ons beginpunt. Jy weet, my broer was in 'n tegniese skool. Nie een van ons was glad nie in so 'n skool. Hy het by Kumba gaan werk omdat hy tegnies is. En dadelik toe hy plaas toe kom, ons het presies geweet in watter rol hy gaan ingaan. So ek dink ons het gaan kyk, waar was jy op skool? Hoekom was jy op skool? Waar het jy gaan swat? Hoekom het jy geswat? Toe jy oorsee gaan werk, op watse plaas het jy gaan werk? Wat het jy gedoen daar? Jy wil tog jou passie uitleef. En ons het in daai verskillende rigtings op die plaas ingegaan. 'n Verband, nie een van ons is jy weet, laat ek 'n finansiële raadgewer kan wees. So ons het ouens ingetrek wat ons raad kan gee. Ons kry nog steeds vandag boekhouers in wat ons raad gee, want dit is ons boerdery se swakpunt. Daar's nie 'n ou wat in die finansiële kant ingaan nie. Ek hanteer saam met hom Theo ook na die finansies, maar ek het tekortkominge daarin, so ons kry raadgewers in en dis maar die rigting wat ons inslaan. En my pa is die overseeing bo aan, ek wil net genoem in verband met dit. My pa sê maar 66. So 'n ou neem 'n besluit uitgekraafd redelik. En hy's overseeing, en wat ons van hom gedoen het, hy het ons elkeen 'n geleentheid gegee, en ons het toe gegaan om te sê, ek bedoel stres maak 'n persoon dood, en ons het hom van die stres goed afgehaal, so hy's overseeing, maar ons is die manne wat kraaf op die grond, wat die deals doen, wat ek wil amper sê sleg slaap, het klink seker nie reg nie, maar en ek bedoel, ons sê toe vir mekaar om sy lewe te spaar, beteken vir ons baie meer as wat hy nog moet kraft. Ons is almal jong manne, laat ons die kraftwerk doen. Hy is die overseeing man en ons kan hom nog vir jy weet, baie lank spaar om ons raad te gee ensovoorts, om dit oor te dra na die volgende geslag.
Baie belangrike, a very important point on that is that one must be very careful to see the exit of the old generation as an event. It is in more cases than not a process that evolves over time, needs planning because it needs to be discussed and planned for, but critically the role of the exiting or the generation, daar's 'n baie mooi Afrikaanse woord, afskaal. Die generasie wat afskaal. Dis nie aftree nie, dis in baie gevalle afskaal. That slowing down process is almost that, if you look at the decision pyramid, you almost move up in the structure, where you become more strategic, more to do with capital allocation, more to do with the direction of the strategy we are going than to the day-to-day business. But it needs to be a process, and part of that process is not only to empower the next generation, but it's also to assist the next generation with making the critical long-term decisions and prepare them for that. So it's a process. Underlying that process is communication. Communication to set out what is the plan, what is the direction, and let's implement it. Where people make a mistake sometimes is they believe that it should be a point in time. There is a day. Now, what is important, at some point, the baton needs to go from one generation to the next. There is a point where this critical decision making moves. That's also true. But the process is not necessarily on one day it happens. It is a process that needs to be planned, but it needs to happen at some point.
Yeah, and that needs to be communicated to the structures of the business underneath.
Not only communicated, but buy in. Everybody needs to buy into this process and decide, this is how we are going to approach this. Because remember, if your dream is to have a successful family business that will be an asset to generations to come, that means an asset to somebody that might not even be born today, but will be an asset for generations to come. Those decisions need to be in line with that. And that means there will generations come and generations will go. A great example is, and I'm going to quote the Karsten boerdery because he's said it publicly. Pieter Karsten is the next generation running the business, a big family farming business. And he made a point at some stage and said, remember, I grew up with the knowledge that I do not have a farm. I will never have a farm. If everything goes well, I'll be the CEO of the family business for a period of time. So for a period of time, he'll be the caretaker, he'll be responsible, but then he will hand it over. But he's never going to own a farm. He might be, if everything goes well, for a period of time, the CEO of the family business. And that's the mindset you need to bring in. You are there for a 20 or 30 year period. You are there to better the business, but you are also there to transfer the business to the next generation.
We started off with that critical question, do we want to be a family business or not?
Yes.
When does it not make sense for a business, a family business, to continue being a family business?
I'll give you a very simple example. There's a very well-known family agriculture business. It's a fifth generation business. There's 3 daughters. All 3 of them have immigrated to Australia. So what happens now? The dad decided that it's been there for 4 generations, but none of the kids want to come back to South Africa. So the role now for him is, and he took that role passionately, is to liquidate, sell the business for as much capital as he can. It doesn't make sense if the family members decide we don't want to be part of the family business. Then you can't force it, because then you're going to lose the asset. So the decision of not continuing is a decision of the members of the family to decide, look, we don't want this to continue. If you then force it, you're going to lose the whole thing. If you don't, and then obviously there's other factors. If everybody's immigrated, you can't continue with a family farming business. Or if there's no succession plan in place and nobody wants to farm, don't force it, because then you're going to lose the whole thing.
I want to sort of start looking at some critical advice for people. And we've given a lot of advice. But if we can maybe clarify some of those points into those outcomes, what do you want people that you work with and consult with to take away from the whole process? And if we can start with you, George.
Yeah, only planning, planning. And what we like is to start with the end in mind, to say, look, we know that this generation, the business has to be transferred to the next generation. So we know that a person would have to, a person will pass away or the person will have to retire. And then to unpack it from there, to say, what is the components of succession that we need to deal with here? Because when the person passes away, you need to understand what is the liquidity implication on the business. What is the cost implications around it? Because there's loan accounts and there's estate duty and capital gains tax. And then you can do the liquidity calculation and the estate plan and work back and see whether, you've provided for that. Then you can answer the question of, do we have facilities in the family business where the farmer signs surety and, that facility needs to be settled? So what is the cash flow position around that? And do we need to have discussions around, with the bank or the company that provided the finance? And then you can also look at and say, look, we need succession because the person is going to retire or pass away. So we need succession on directorship level, on the operational companies. We need succession on trustees. Who will the new trustees be, to make decisions around the assets and how the wealth will be transferred to the next generation. You need to look at financial planning, because the person retires. So there's a lot of different divisions within the family business. And often, when you start at the end, then you can identify the different succession planning that you require in each division of the family business.
Stefan, if you had to give family businesses a piece of advice that would really sort of clarify that thinking process and set them on the right path.
You know what, Anli? I like to think that one needs to start with the status quo. In other words, if you look at the documentation that's on the table today, because that's the way, if the acts fall today, that's the papers that talk. I mean, the talking is over then. The person cannot talk anymore. So I like to start as a point of departure with the situation as per today. What does the will say currently? What does the trust deed looks like? Who's the income beneficiaries, the capital beneficiaries, the trustees? Does the trust deed encompass a situation of is it a generation skipping device? Those kind of things. So I really like to start from that point of departure. If there's, in Afrikaans we have a saying, it's a proefbereddering van 'n boedel. Look at the situation as is. If you should do a proefbereddering van 'n boedel, what would SARS see? What would the master see? What would the external party see? What would be the legacy that's left to the descendants? So that's for me the principal point of departure. And once you get feedback from that, from the results there, you convey those messages to the family. And sometimes the messages that falls on that ears, is amazing. And therefrom starts the planning then.
I can see you want to tell us. You've got so much you want to share.
That it's not definitive and it's not linear. So you talk about like succession, the handing over, senior generation letting go, the next generation taking over. Understand the emotional aspect. Because intellectually, the senior generation have handed over, but emotionally they haven't. So when you're having these conversations and talking about, it took a while. I suddenly realized it's buy, sell, or hold. If it's clear we're going to grow this business and we want to take it forward and we've got the opportunity, because the family capital is not just the finances, it's the experience, it's the networks they've got, everything else that goes with that. And just one thing on trust, you generally put the land into a separate trust to the business, which might be in a trust or to a company or whatever it is that you actually have. So they're not absolute terms, and that's why it's so difficult, because what's happening in South Africa, the reality right now, a lot of South African young people in relation to the agricultural sector are returning to South Africa, and they're prepared to come into the business. To make that decision at a point in time and try and force it can be problematic. That's why we might not be selling. Sometimes it just makes eminent sense. Let's sell. Because, they said as a family business advisor, how can you, Tony, be endorsing selling? I said, if that's the right solution for the family, then sell. But maybe you need to look at holding and say, we're going to hold this over here. The other thing is, don't centralize the control in an individual. That's fine with John Wayne, who founded the business, centralized it in a structure, like an executive committee, whatever you want to call it. And the wonderful way this family business operates, they clearly got that. They might not call it an executive committee, but they are operating like that. Bring the outsiders on. Bring outsiders in. The person that I stated last time, he's a non-executive independent director on a lot of family businesses around South Africa, and those guys are critical. They just bring the experience and the insight.
Stefan was talking about how important it is to put it on paper. And I think that's perhaps sometimes a shortfall where families discuss things, there seem to be clear, open lines of communication, everyone knows their role, but they haven't sort of foreseen those conflict situations. In your experience, Tony, what have you found in terms of having a clear paper trail and perhaps even to a point as saying non-executive director, executive director, this is your title? Because people think, titles, we're not Vodacom, we don't need that corporate structure.
Look, if anybody understands corporate governance, they will not want to be a director. Honestly, it's such an onerous responsibility that for somebody to come along and to say, I'm a director in my family business, if they really understood what it is, they wouldn't want to just take that on. So titles really don't mean anything, to be quite honest. And they shouldn't mean much in a family business. Yeah, maybe outside, yes, it's got a role. But those governance structures, governance of the family, so the family creed that's been spoken about, mine might be a softer type document before you get into the harder documents. That's important. The memorandum of incorporation, the shareholders' agreements, if you've got outsiders that are involved, those contractual things are critical. The way you've structured the trust, the independent trustees, the role that they play in ensuring the continuity. Heaven forbid if dad or mom suddenly fell over dead, what would happen in relation to the business? Because maybe the next generation are in their late 20s, early 30s. So how do they deal with that? So there's a lot of facets to it, but I'm saying start at the soft end and then work towards it. But you've got to, at the end of the day, have that documentation to go back to when the problems inevitably rise over time because of maybe saying to a family member, you're still worthy as a family member, but you might not have brought your career into the business, and yet you've got all these ownership rights, and maybe they can play a role in relation to the ownership structures that are in place. So you might have a family shareholders committee, and you've got something called a family council, where you're dealing with the softer issues of family, talking about the history. I mean, some families that I've been with, they brought the products along. The next generation didn't even know these were their products, and they're major brands that are sitting in their house.
Theo, some people in the family business, like we've said, might not be in the family business, in the running of the business, but they can still contribute. Maybe tell us about that and some of the other points that you feel we've sort of missed along the way.
Yeah, let me just first, I'm going to say it in Afrikaans. Oupa se testament agter die klavier is nie opvolgbeplanning nie. Net so is 'n lewenspolis nie opvolgbeplanning nie. And you've noted here, it is a lot more intrinsic if you wanted to sustain. My view is that the first critical decision you should make is, do you want to be a family business or not? If you want to be a family business, you need to take responsibility to manage the structures as a family business. Now, I believe that if you decide to be a family business, in order to make it easier, decide what your vision is, or even your dream, in 20 or 30 years' time is. And once you've decided what that dream is, you can take that dream and you can then work back and say, let's look at all the documentation now in place. Does this documentation talk to the dream over 20 or 30 years?
Can I just interrupt you there? Because we know how volatile agriculture is. The conditions change all the time. Perhaps 10 years ago, we would have been wise to say, hang on, we can see this energy crisis coming, we need to make plans for that now. But that is not always the case. How does the volatility of agriculture create a specifically difficult climate for this kind of planning?
Look, the point is that because agriculture is volatile and because it's difficult to predict, you need a certain kind of entrepreneurship and a certain kind of personality to manage a agriculture business. But that doesn't mean that you can have long-term plans for that. You can surely have long-term plans for it. In effect, if you don't have long-term plans, The ANC is not going to take your farm. Your neighbour's going to take your farm, simply because he has better farming practices than you have. So the point is, even though it's volatile and it is an unpredictable environment, that makes it so much more critical that the younger generation needs to understand the cash flow of the business, the risks of the business. How do we adapt to changes in the business? And the problem there is sometimes the older generation, as a nice word, the John Wayne generation, sometimes does not include the younger generation. Now, if you, just to take a simple example, in any credit application at the bank or your local agriculture company, part of the criteria is to what extent does the next generation have the ability to manage that business. But that's kind of beside the point. The way you start off with is where you want to be in 20 or 30 years' time as a family business. Look at the documentation in place, and then you need to start to structure your planning process accordingly. And that starts with setting out the dream, the vision, the mission, and then all the elements that we talked about succession planning. So it's a process. But, as I said in the beginning, family businesses worldwide is a very successful form of business. But people need to work on it, plan it, and structure it accordingly. Otherwise, it's not going to survive the families, the generations.
So financial flexibility and adaptability is not just necessary for good business practices, but it's also important to build a flexibility component into your succession plan.
And remember, for a family business, you have to be very careful. I've seen family businesses where the flaw in the business is the families that are not part of the business expecting or starting to rely on a dividend, or in the case of where there's various trusts owning the property, rely on that rent income coming in. The problem is they must never expect that as a given, because the primary decision is what's in the best interest of the family business, not of an individual family member that is surfing on the east coast of Australia, and on the 25th of the month he lives like a trustafarian of sorts. The trust needs to pay out. That should never become the situation. Every decision should be what's in the best interest of the long-term sustainability of the business, and then only of family members. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
Can I just say, just something to mention in terms of, family money is patient money. It's got a long-term orientation in relation to that money. I advocate a base dividend that people know. So some person might not be getting a good revenue, but there's a base dividend. Regardless of how the company does, that dividend will be paid. What happens is the extraordinary dividend gets taken as being the new norm. Or I call it a session I have with families who stole the money. They see they've got loan accounts, whether it's in the trust or wherever it is, but they haven't had a right to that money because that's invested in the business that is actually generating that wealth. So one's got to get that balance there.
Can I throw
Hasn't got a right
the...
to that. Hasn't got a right. Yeah. Remember, once the rights entitlements become the discussion, you've got problems.
I want to throw a cat among the pigeons and say, anyone who is alive works so that they can have a certain quality of life. Yes, you might think of legacy and down the line, and my children's children need to be looked after. But people generally do that as a next step. You need to reach some kind of a base level of, my needs are taken care of, I have security, before you can start thinking, nobody makes money for their grandchildren while they're living in, penny pinching or hanging, I'm not going to buy croissants, I'm going to only buy white bread, or, whatever the case may be. So is it realistic to think of a family business as everything needs to go back into the business? How do you set those base levels? Because one person's base level of this is a good standard of living is not necessarily their brothers or their sisters. That's a complex consideration, or not?
Yeah, it is. But the point is, those in the business that work in the business would like to grow the business. So they want to reinvest. Those other side of the business say, well, I'd like to get money out to sustain a certain lifestyle. And that is problematic because they become, as you said, trust beneficiaries. And their purpose in life doesn't exist. So it's a very fine balance. And that's why you got to have all these conversations, because I'd be very concerned if somebody says, I'm going to just surrender, I'm going to go sit on and so forth. Am I actually fulfilling what I as an individual are created to do? And so you even influence that as this decision-making body in relation to the family business. But the best expression I've heard is treat family as family, business as business, and the owners with the respect they deserve and the structures that are there.
But there's not a simple one-fits-all model. There is, what people also need to understand is that, specifically in the agriculture sector, the vast majority of farms or agriculture businesses cannot sustain more than 2 generations on the farm. They simply don't have the cash flow, they don't have the profitability, so be very careful to say that there's 2 or 3 generations that needs to live off the farm. The vast majority of South African farming enterprises can perhaps generate the father and the son, or sustain the father and the son's family on the farm. Nothing more. And one needs to be very careful. Otherwise, the farming entity is not going to survive. So, the rules that might apply to a big intergenerational mega farming operation might be absolutely different from a farm where it can sustain the father and the son. Now, if you look at most of the, and I'm specifically going to refer to the Western Cape tradition, most of the Western Cape farming enterprises that's 6, 7, 8, 9 generations old actually goes to the oldest son or the oldest daughter, or the most, let's say the most competent son or daughter. It never gets sliced up, and there's never more than one family benefiting. Now, the theory behind that is that the other children, the other brothers and sisters, might get an education from the farm. The farm might assist them to go to university, but in the end, the farm goes from one generation to a single next generation, simply because the farming enterprise cannot survive if it needs to look after more than a next generation or a next generation. And one needs to be very careful once you make those decisions. Then you get to the point, is fairness the same as treating everybody equal? And fairness might mean that everybody gets a job. And the one that gets a job to stay on the farm, he's got a 20-year job or 30-year job to manage the farming entity, but that's what he got. The other's got a degree, got a qualification, but everybody needs to look after themselves. So be very careful to assume that all farming operations can sustain kids and siblings getting something out of the farm. A lot of farming operations cannot afford that, and that should be clear. It should be clarified, it should be structured as such, otherwise the asset's not going to sustain anything.
Gerard, ek wil by jou eindig voor ons vra uit die gehoor uitvat. Ons praat oor langtermynbeplanning, ons praat oor generasies, ons kyk na die toekoms. So, julle is nou 2 generasies op die plaas sover, jou pa, 3 boeties. Hoe lyk julle visie van die toekoms vir julle kinders?
Ja, en ek dink ons moet net besef, ons is net rentmeters, ons is tydelik. Jy moet hom beter los as wat jy hom gekry het. En ek dink, jy weet, ons sê altyd, ons het amper gaan oplees oor die goed, om te sê, die eerste generasie werk ons hard, hy bou dit op, die tweede generasie hardloop met die idees en die boerdery, en die derde generasie breek dit af. Toe het ek so rukkie terug, ons het maar almal dit, jy weet, want hy lewe ons nou lekker, maar toe het ons rukkie terug, het ek in 'n beweegblad van Whitey Beson gelees. Jy weet, is ook alles dieselfde, die eerste 2 generasies, en toe sê hy die derde generasie, as hulle net afbreek en ek wil amper sê geld uitgee tussen hakies, dan sit die tweede generasie ouers se skuld dat dit gebeur het. Jy weet, ek dink ons moet ons denkerigting daar verander, so, wat in die toekoms gebeur, jy as ouer, as jy opslip met sekere basics vir jou kinders leer, dan is dit, dan veroorsaak jy eintlik dat die derde generasie dit verspeel. So, wat ons maar doen, Ek bedoel ons wil almal boer. Ons wil suksesvol wees. Ek bedoel ons is boer in murg en been, maar jy moet volhoubaar wees. So ons hele droom is om volhoubaar te wees. Jy weet, gronde wat jy koop, as jy kan 30 jaar vooruit dink. Ek vat 'n voorbeeld, nuwe aardappelgronde. Jy weet, dan is jou denkerigting in die regte rigting. Jy moet maar kyk wat is huidigelik suksesvol en maak diversifiseer jou besigheid. Jy lewe vandag, maar as jy rigtings het, verskillende rigtings wat jou besigheid kan inslaan, dan maak jy dit net meer volhoubaar. Alles wat ons het, is risiko. So versprei jou risiko in alles wat jy doen.
Hoeveel kinders is daar tussen die 3 broers?
Man, daar's 2 dogtertjies tussen die broers, en dan is daar 7 seentjies. Op die oomblik.
So daar lê vir julle 'n aansienlike uitdaging voor.
In landbouterme, die familie teel vinniger as wat die boerdery groei.
en almal het nog hulle eerste vrouens, dit moet ek ja, so ons probeer, jy weet, daar's 'n paar beginsels wat ons uitleef, jy weet, ons is nog maar jonk, en al die kinders is in die koshuis. Jy weet, ons van die plaas is 10 kilos van die dorp af, my tweede broer is 10 kilos, en om Callie Skoeman het by ons gekom, en my broer, hy sê, waar is die kinders? Hy sê, nee, oom, hulle is allemaal in die koshuis, en hy kon dit nie glo nie, maar ons het allemaal deur koshuis gekom, en ek dink, jy weet, my male was in 'n koshuis, so ek dink, jy weet, as 'n ou ver vooruit dink, dis goed wat jou hart maak, selfstandig maak, konflikhantering, respek vir 'n ouer ou in die koshuis, jy weet, ek dink dis als deel van jou boublokke. En al daai goed is ongelooflik belangrik. Ek dink baie keer ons gaan soek die goed buite, maar ek dink hier by jou huis en by jou strukture wat jy van grondvlak af opbou is ongelooflik belangrik.
Dit is dalk nou nog te vroeg om te begin met die opvolgbeplanning vir die nuwe generasie, maar dit sal interessant wees om te sien waartoe julle eendag gaan. Ja, Theo.
Onthou die kern is, hoeveel jy ook al neerskryf, die volgende generasie leer meer uit die gedrag van die ouer generasie as uit enigiets anderster. So die gedrag van die ouer generasie gaan bepaal hoe die jonger generasie gaan voel oor die familieboerdery.
And that's where the emotion comes into it, and the mentorship and the responsibility, the modeling. I'd like to take the opportunity for anyone in our audience who has questions for our panel members. If you could raise your hand and then we'll get a microphone to you. Any questions? There we go, thank you.
Dame voorsitter, baie dankie aan die paneel vir 'n baie interessante en insiggewende gesprek. Theo het dit raak aangeneem. Die ekonomie van skaal in die landbou is vir my nogal een van die groot bronne van kommer. As ek nou sien hoe ontblank of minder kommersiële boere daar op die plase is, en dit is een van die groot probleme, dink ek, opvolgbeplanning as gevolg van dit kan nie altyd tot sy reg kom nie. Ek vra dit maar net, maar ek sien dit raak. Ek sê net die moeilike situasie in die landbou rondom die ekonomie. Hoe groter jy gaan, hoe beter. Maar jou kleinboer is daar amper nie meer.
Ek wil net by ons het 2 minute en dan moet ons ongelukkig klaarmaak, maar dankie.
Dis 'n realiteit wêreldwyd, en ongelukkig beteken dit dat die boerdery vereis meer kundige mense om dit te bestuur. Anderster kan hy nie voortbestaan nie. En net soos die boerdery meer kundigheid vereis op 'n groter vlak, moet die beplanning dit vereis, want om elke keer die plaas in 3 te deel, gaan nie werk nie. So jy gaan op 'n punt kom wat jy die moeilike besluite moet maak. Wie kan plaas toe kom en wie kan nie plaas toe kom nie. En daai besluit moet gemaak word terwyl almal nog met mekaar praat. Jy kan nie daai besluit maak die dag as die kalf van die put is nie. Daai besluit moet gemaak word as almal met mekaar praat en ons kan reëls neerlê hoe dit gaan werk. En dit kom terug. Jy's bevoorreg om gebore te word in 'n familiebesigheid. Jy is nie entitled tot enige iets nie. Maar ja, jy's heeltemal reg. Ongelukkig hoe meer landbou skaalbesighede word, hoe kleiner raak die kans om 'n besigheid in 3 of 4 te deel elke generasie. Eenvoudig gaan nie werk nie.
Just an observation, private equity funds have stepped in to fund in the agricultural industry and help them professionalize to reach those critical masses that's been referred to.
And luckily, we also have technology in the mix. Technology is going to assist businesses more and more going into the future to make these kind of transitions a lot easier, a lot smoother for critical skills transfer to happen at a faster pace to enable that transition to be sustainable. Thank you so much. Thank you to our speakers for sharing your insights with us. Thank you to our audience for being here today, for listening, for sharing your time with us. And we look forward to the 7 other discussions lined up for this year's Nation in Conversation. We invite you to come visit us again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dankie.
Baie dankie.